My name is Douglas Harmon, and I am 68 years old, and I spent 33 years building a commercial printing business from a single leased machine in a rented space to a company with 41 employees and 3 locations. And I want you to understand what building something like that teaches you. Before I tell you what my wife and my business partner did, because building a business teaches you one thing more reliably than anything else, which is that the most important protections are the ones you put in place before you think you need them. And I learned that lesson twice in my professional life, and the second time the lesson had nothing to do with business and everything to do with my marriage. And I want to tell you about my business partner Frank before I tell you what he did, because Frank and I had worked together for 19 years, and there is a specific kind of trust that develops between men who have built something together. Over 19 years, it is not the same as friendship. Exactly, it is something more structural than friendship. It is the trust of people who have survived the same difficult years and made the same difficult decisions and emerged on the same side. And I had believed that trust was solid the way I believed certain structures were solid. And I had been wrong about structures before, and I should have known better. And my wife Carolyn and I had been married for 28 years, and the marriage had been good for most of those years in the specific way that marriages are good when 2 people are building something together, and then the building was done, and the children were grown, and the business was established, and what remained was the 2 of us in a house that felt larger than it once had. And Carolyn had been suggesting for 2 years that I spend less time at the business and more time with her, and I had been accommodating this suggestion gradually and insufficiently, the way men who have spent 30 years building something accommodate the suggestion that they should build less. And in January of the year this story happened, I noticed that Frank had become less available than he had been for 2 decades, and that Carolyn had become less available in a different way, and I did not want to connect those 2 observations, so I did not for longer than I should have, and the connection announced itself in April when I arrived at the office on a Saturday morning and found Frank's car and Carolyn's car in the parking lot, and I sat in my own car for a long time before I went inside, and what I found when I went inside confirmed what the parking lot had already told me, and I drove home, and I sat in my kitchen, and I thought about 33 years of putting protections in place before I needed them, and I thought about a specific document that Frank and I had signed in the 3rd year of our partnership when we had engaged a business attorney named Patricia to formalize our arrangement, and the document was a partnership agreement, and within that partnership agreement was a clause that Patricia had recommended and that Frank and I had both signed, and the clause addressed what happened to a partner's interest in the business in the event of a breach of fiduciary duty, and the clause was specific and detailed, and it had been drafted by Patricia, who was very good at her job, and I had not thought about that clause in 15 years because I had not needed to. And I called Patricia on Monday morning, and I said, "Patricia, I need to review our partnership agreement." And Patricia said, "Of course." And I went to her office, and we sat together, and Patricia read the relevant clause. And then she looked at me over her reading glasses and said, "Douglas, this is very clean language." And I said, "Patricia helped draft it." And she almost smiled and said what happened. And I told her. And Patricia set the document down and said, "The conduct you are describing falls within the definition of breach in this clause." And I said, "I know." And she said, "The Remedy specified is a mandatory buyout at the valuation formula on page 12, and I said I know, and Patricia said, Douglas, this means Frank is required to buy out your interest at the formula price within 90 days, or forfeit his own interest to you, and I said, I know, Patricia, I signed the document, and Patricia said, do you want to proceed? And I said, yes, and the letter went to Frank the following Thursday, and Frank called me that afternoon, and his voice had the quality of a man who has just read something he did not expect to read, and he said, Douglas, and I said, Frank, and he said the clause, and I said yes, and he said, I did not think you would actually, and I said, Frank, I spent 33 years putting protections in place before I needed them, and he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, Carolyn and I are, and I said, Frank, I am not calling you about Carolyn, I am calling you about the clause in our partnership agreement, and you have 90 days to execute the buyout, and I ended the call and sat in my kitchen with Patricia's letter in my hand, and I thought about 33 years and the single leased machine in a rented space, and the 41 employees and the 3 locations, and I thought about the 3rd year of the partnership when Patricia had recommended the clause, and Frank and I had both signed without imagining we would ever need it, and I thought that the most important protections are always the ones you put in place before you think you need them. And Frank executed the buyout within 60 days because the alternative was worse for him, and I used the proceeds to do something I had been postponing for years, which was retire completely and travel, and I have been to 4 countries in the past 18 months, and I take photographs, and I read in the afternoons, and I have coffee in the mornings in whatever city I happen to be in. And the business continues under Frank's ownership, and I do not follow its progress because I built it, and I protected what I built, and then I let it go. And if you have ever built something and wondered whether the protections you put in place were necessary, I want you to hear this. The protections are always necessary, and the time to think about them is never after you need them, it is before. And the clause on page 12 of A. Partnership agreement I signed in the 3rd year of a 19-year. Partnership was the most important thing I ever put my name on.